Hello, lovers of exciting stories, get ready to dive into an intense and touching narrative that explores the deepest secrets of the human heart. This is a story of redemption, understanding and, above all, self-discovery. I'm John, your narrator, and today we're going to explore a story that will stir your emotions and thoughts. My name is Michael, and this is the story of my father, a man whose life was marked by narcissism. But before I tell you about his last words, it's important to understand who he was and how he impacted my life. I grew up seeing my father, Richard, as a distant and difficult man. When he was there was always a cloud of tension hanging over us. The few memories I have of my childhood with him are punctuated by arguments and tears. My mother, Emily, a beautiful and lively woman, seemed to wither under the weight of the constant arguments. And I, still small, observed all of this, trying to understand my role in that chaotic scenario. The story actually begins a few years before I was born. My parents were two young people in love, as we can see in the few photos that remain from their wedding. Two hippies from the 70s, radiating happiness and hope. I remember a specific photo where my mother had a sparkle in her eyes that I never saw again. It was a look of pure joy, which was lost with the passage of time and the disappointments that accumulated. After a few years, I was born. In the photos, I see my father holding me with a genuine smile. We seemed inseparable, like two inseparable friends. However, this phase of happiness did not last long. My father left us when I was just 4 years old. He was always searching for something he could never find at home: happiness, validation, or perhaps himself. My mother tried to rebuild our lives, but the marks of my father's absence remained. He had several wives after her, each replaced in an attempt to fill a void that seemed insatiable. It was only when he was a grown man that we finally had the opportunity to truly talk. On one of these rare occasions, we gathered for an intimate moment. He poured a glass of whiskey and lit a cigar for me. During this conversation, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before: a deep sadness. With tears almost overflowing, he said, "I don't deserve this." I wasn't there to judge him. He still carried a childish need for his approval and affection. And it was at that moment, between sips of whiskey and drags of cigars, that he said something that would change my perspective forever. "Michael, I never knew myself." Those words were an echo of a lifetime of endless searching. My father never knew who he really was. He bounced from relationship to relationship, career to career, always looking for something or someone to give him a sense of identity that he couldn't find in himself. For my father, stability was a foreign concept. He needed constant external validation, and in a stable relationship, that validation eventually wanes. The other person stops telling you all. This insatiable need prevented him from forming deep, meaningful bonds, including with his children. The time how amazing you are, and that's when you need to know who you are to sustain the relationship. But he never had that basis. This revelation helped me understand the nature of his narcissism and, more importantly, it made me reflect on my own life. I realized the importance of knowing myself, of finding stability within myself and not in external factors. Unlike my father, I decided to be a man who knows who he is, who values his relationships and who finds happiness in his own identity. Let's go back in time a little to better understand how Richard became who he was. Richard was born in a small town in the American Midwest into a middle-class family. His father, my grandfather, was a strict and distant man, and his mother, a submissive woman who always put herself in the background. Richard grew up feeling the need to constantly prove himself, seeking approval in all areas of his life. As a teenager, he stood out as an athlete, attracting the attention of everyone at school. He loved the feeling of being admired and began to depend on this attention to feel good about himself. It was during this period that he met Emily, my mother, a charming girl full of dreams. They quickly fell in love, drawn to each other by the promise of freedom and adventure. The pain of my father's emotional absence marked me deeply, and I promised myself that I would not follow the same path. Determined to be different, I threw myself into studying and building healthy, stable relationships. They married young and moved to the big city in search of a better life. The early years were full of hope and love, but soon the pressures of adulthood began to take a toll on them. Richard, accustomed to being the center of attention, struggled to deal with the responsibilities of being a husband and, later, a father. He felt trapped, unable to find the same validation he had received in his youth. The incessant search for validation led Richard to seek out other women and adventures, hoping to fill the void he felt within himself. Each new relationship began with passion and enthusiasm, but soon he found himself dissatisfied and restless, moving on to the next conquest. This constant search prevented him from building any lasting bond, including a bond with his own family. When I was a teenager, I began to realize the destructive pattern my father was trapped in. I watched my mother struggle to keep the house together while Richard lost himself in his own dissatisfactions. It was only many years later, as my father was aging and facing health problems, that he began to reflect on his life. I was already an adult, living my own life, but I still felt the need to understand my father and maybe, in some way, help him find peace. One cold winter afternoon, I received a call from Richard asking us to meet. He looked frail and haggard, a shadow of the man I knew. I accepted the invitation with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. We met in his small apartment, where he lived alone, surrounded by memories of a turbulent past. Richard greeted me with a hesitant hug, and together we sat at the kitchen table. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and, after a long silence, began to speak. For the first time, he seemed willing to open his heart and share his deepest truths. "Michael," he began, his voice shaking, "I'm sorry for everything. I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I spent my whole life looking for something I could never find." His words took me by surprise. I expected yet another attempt to justify his actions, but instead I saw a broken man, trying to make peace with his past. "I never knew who I was," he continued. "I always sought validation from others, thinking it would make me happy. But the more I sought it, the more lost I became. I could never be happy for long anywhere or with anyone. Nobody." I remained silent, letting his words echo in the room. I realized that despite all the suffering he had caused, Richard was finally confronting his own demons. "Father," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I understand that you have had your challenges. But you are not alone. We are here now, and perhaps there is still time to find peace." Richard looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, son. I just wanted you to know that, despite everything, I always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it." That conversation was a turning point in our relationship. Although he couldn't undo the past, Richard began making genuine efforts to reconnect with me and the other family members. He sought professional help to deal with his emotional issues and began participating in support groups. Over the next few months, I saw a slow but significant change in my father. He began to recognize his mistakes and appreciate the little things in life. Our conversations became more frequent and sincere. And although there were still hurt feelings, we began to build a new foundation of understanding and forgiveness. Unfortunately, time was not on our side. Richard's health rapidly deteriorated due to heart complications. In his final days, he was hospitalized and I was by his side. One silent afternoon, as I held his hand, he looked at me and said his last words, "Michael, forgive me. Find your happiness, and never stop being who you are." Those words echoed inside me as he took his last breath. Richard is gone, but he left me with a priceless gift, the understanding that despite his many flaws, he was a man who, in the end, sought redemption and peace. So, dear listeners, the lesson is clear. Know yourself. Don't look to others for validation that should come from within. Be stable, be committed, and discover who you really are. Don't make the same mistakes my father made. I hope this story touched you as much as it touched me. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the World of Stories channel for more exciting and inspiring stories. To the next